Okay, thank you, Ruth. Over to you.
Okay. Well, gosh, it's so nice to see so many familiar faces. So it feels strange sort of sharing this, but I know some of you will have seen bits and pieces of it. So I'm Ruth Knight, if you don't know me, and I'm Head of Sustainability for English Heritage. So I've been in this role for about a year and a half now, which is a brand new role for English Heritage. Not to say there wasn't work on sustainability already taking place, but it didn't really have a single strategy. There wasn't a single point of contact, and there wasn't a number of targets or a strategy as such in place. So coming in July 21, I immediately started building the climate action plan. And what I'm going to talk about today is just give you a bit of background to sort of how that developed, and then go through what the targets are, and also give you a bit of an update on delivery and how we're going with that. For those who are not so familiar with English Heritage, I think hopefully people are, but we became a charity in 2015, so we're in that phase of becoming financially sustainable and a standalone charity that sort of worked for the first period of strategy. Then we had the pandemic, obviously. And now we're coming into our next sort of 5-year strategy plan. And as you can see, this climate action plan is for the next 3 years. So in terms of developing the plan, as you can imagine, coming into an organisation in a new role, I spent a lot of time talking to people, a lot of individual calls with the sort of heads of department, a lot of site visits. It's a hard life. Going out to some of our sort of 420 sites and getting a taster for what was happening already, where the opportunities were and where the challenges were. Part of that obviously was talking to all the different teams. You know, it's quite a complex organisation for a relatively small organisation, so you know, all the different side of curatorial, collections, site teams, commercial side, and so on. This climate action plan reaches across the entire organisation, and I think although I sit in the estates directorate, it's really great that the role around sustainability is seen as something that is very much across the organisation and not just sort of buildings, or not just, you know, finance or whatever. I also luckily had the opportunity to go to these 3 start the season workshops, which is where all the site managers from across the organisation get together, actually in person, which was amazing after the pandemic. And there it was fantastic because you got the opportunity to have workshops and to talk to people in more detail, to understand some of the pressures, what was possible at site and what wasn't possible at site. So all of that really helped sort of build an idea of what the climate action plan should and shouldn't be. There was also kind of the obvious thing around getting a baseline, a really strong, robust baseline for the organisation. So there'd been some work, quite a lot of work done on sort of energy. The top, you know, the top 10 properties have been looked at for energy. It was called the Energy Improvement Programme. So we had some documents around that. There was some historic carbon footprint data, but again, very much based on scope 1 and 2. So I worked with 3Adapt, went out to the market, appointed 3Adapt, who I know many of you will know and have worked with. They looked across all our data, and their brief was to give us a baseline to understand where the data was in terms of its quality and the gaps in data, which is really important, and help us set a target, a net zero target, but also to give us a sort of rough decarbonisation pathway towards that. So that's what they did. They were great to work with. We ended up with this carbon footprint. You can see very heavily dominated by purchases in our case. Big chunky piece of scope 1 and 2 to focus on. A chunk of retail and F&B. You know, very much dodgy data there in terms of the fact that it's very much based on spend, not on the individual carbon footprint of things, and that is something that we are drilling down into in the climate action plan. Not at all unusual, as you know. You can see there the travel, as you might suspect, that's not visitor travel. When we put visitor travel in from the data we had, which was mainly pre-booking data from during the pandemic, which of course is not necessarily that representative, that was absolutely colossal. The visitor carbon footprint is huge. And what we've done is we've put that in the climate action plan. We've shown what it is, but we haven't included it in our footprint at the moment. However, you know, it is something that we are revisiting. we're doing stuff around trying to reduce our carbon footprint in terms of visitor travel already, and in 2025 we've committed to revisit that and potentially put that into our carbon footprint. But for the moment, to show any kind of impact, we needed to focus on what we can control. So we set a target, we set a 2040 target. We were already committed to doing a 2050 target through our Arts Council loan. We wanted to be a little bit more ambitious with that, but we also appreciated that we've got a relatively challenging portfolio. So we set 2040. And we doesn't tell you a huge amount, this graph, but the general decarbonisation trajectory worked by selecting a scenario out of low, medium or high for each of the different sort of main areas of action. So that was a useful process. It got us a document that gives us that baseline. We will revisit it. We're not going to revisit it every year, clearly, because again, as you'll be familiar with, some of that carbon footprint will go up as we find out more detail. In fact, a lot of it already is, in terms of sort of drilling down into some of the information, particularly around staff travel. So clearly, as part of the Climate Action Plan, we needed to set the vision. Very keen to make it as concise as possible as a report. So based on the evidence from across the organisation, driven by targets, very specific, as specific as we could possibly make them. And although clearly we can't sign up to science-based targets being a charity, it was very much aligned with science-based targets and aligned with the climate science. Also, you can see the words very much around being coordinated and proactive and progressive, and something that is owned across the organisation. All helping sort of make it something that is a plan we're doing together rather than something led by a sustainability team alone. So it has 4 pillars, very much people first. That was very important. The other thing to note here was that it was really key to have it as a very holistic plan. Very keen not to focus just on carbon, but to ensure that we brought in the environmental impacts of around sort of pollution, water, plastics and so on, and look to the future in terms of building that climate resilience. But people obviously has to be up there at the front, because without the people, none of the rest of this will happen. Behind you can see this is a picture of Clifford's Tower, which I might come back to in a moment. I hope you've been. If you haven't, please go. I'm just going to work through sort of those 4 pillars as context and just talk a little bit about where we're progressing and sort of what sort of targets we made. So under the 4 areas, each area has a core metric, which is a top line piece here in bold. So we have 4 big chunky targets, and those are the ones that we're reporting to trustees and putting on our website very much. Underneath that, we have performance indicators. So there are targets here that are either based on information, some of the data that is not as high quality. So they're targets we know we should make, but we're not entirely sure if they're the right level. Or there are areas where we need to get external budget that we don't have at the moment, and so on. So they're slightly less secure as targets, but they're still things we're working on. The other thing to say is that all these targets are owned across the organisation. So different departments will own different targets, and that will be their KPI integrated within their own work. Some are still held by us. So for example, this very first one is still owned in the majority by the sustainability team, and that's very much about engagement. This is our way of doing this particular target is through the Green Impact Programme. And thank you to those who suggested that. So I think this is the NUS originated Green Impact Programme that's been going for about 14 years. And we looked at that and felt it was a really helpful action checklist, particularly for our sites. So at the start of the season, it was very clear that sites wanted very specific actions they could take. Sites are very different. We have big mansion houses, we have one-person sites like Brinkburn Priory. It needed to work across those. That's quite a challenge. It needed to work within the constraints of the fact that some things are managed nationally. There are limits to what can be done in some of these sites. It's got a scheduled monument, there's permissions needed for many things. So the Green Impact Programme and its bespoke version was extremely good for us. It also was excellent because it comes with a project manager, clearly, who can help guide some of that work, and it also allows that linkage through to other organisations. So we've got 16 sites currently working in the pilot of that, from September through to February, and then it will be audited in February by local students, and then the awards will be presented, hopefully awards, bronze, silver or gold will be presented at the start of the season sessions for next year, which is again fantastic because it's a chance to celebrate the sites that are doing sustainable action and sort of raise that up the agenda. And it's been really fascinating to see, you know, I was unsure how it would work out, but actually the take up has been really, really positive, and it's actually organically growing. So we're trying to keep the pilot quite contained, but other sites are quietly joining, which is great. So we found like it works its way along Hadrian's Wall. So another Hadrian's Wall site has just signed up, which is wonderful. But yeah, trying to contain it a little bit at the moment still. Across here, you can see there are lots of other targets, mainly around sort of internal knowledge sharing, a bit of sort of badging our properties for visitors to show what we're doing. So the Green Tourism Award there. We're exploring Green Key at the moment, potentially there. And I wanted to just put in this picture on the right here is Gnomus, a sort of giant puppet figure who roams around and who visited Stonehenge this year. And I think one of the things that's really exciting about our portfolio is the opportunity to use our sites and collections for creative response around climate change. So, you know, we've got a big piece of work coming up in Kenilworth in 2025, a big creative response, but also last year, I think it was, you know, Extinction Rebellion took over Ironbridge. So we need to think about the fact that, you know, as a charity that owns arguably the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, we want to engage with that. We don't necessarily want to leave it to others to interpret that for us. We want to also be part of that conversation. Huge opportunities to talk about human impact on the environment. Just a very quick picture of the Green Impact Programme toolkit. If you haven't seen it, I think so far it's turning out to be a really good tool for us, and we're hoping to progress that, see people sort of uploading some of the actions they're already taking. Moving on to decarbonisation. So this is a big chunky piece of work for us as well. As you can see, we've got this pretty ambitious, bear in mind our portfolio target here for 20% reduction by 2025. I'll talk about that in a moment. Just also to touch on a couple of other areas. EV charging is something we're looking at, sort of a feasibility piece of work for at the moment, where we're looking at 21 sites, which we will bring down to 10. The idea there is we're looking for a commercial partner. We're leasing space to a commercial partner who will do the installation of the technology, the infrastructure, charging infrastructure. One company that will work across those sites will lease that space out. They'll install, and then we'll give them around a 20-year lease. Is what's being looked at the moment, and then once they've clawed back the money that it took to install, a percentage of the profits after that. I'm keen that we get this work going because we've had the sort of interest from our visitors. However, it is an area where we're also keen to signpost EV charging around our sites, because often, as you can imagine, a Scheduled Ancient Monument is not necessarily the best place to install, and some of the power supplies at our sites are not great. Whereas we do have sort of, you know, Helmsley Castle has a car park next to it. That may be the better place for that charger to be. We're also, you know, here are a couple of targets owned by the retail team. So, for example, I mentioned earlier, a lot of our purchases are based on cost carbon footprint conversion rather than the actual carbon footprint. So our retail team are working through the products we have, a very large number of products and suppliers, and trying to understand what the carbon footprint of some of those products are through an EPOS system. And there's a couple of points here also owned by our procurement team. That's around our suppliers, and we've had some really good interaction with our procurement team, who are fantastic and are starting to do such an enhanced engagement around sustainability, but also modern slavery. And lastly on here, just to mention, we're really interested in this life cycle assessment work, and I know lots of you are working on that. It'd be good maybe to pick that up a bit later, but that's something, you know, I saw the National Trust projects guide and how that's been brought in there, and it's certainly something that we're trying to do as well, sort of integrating that into a project approach. I'm going to touch quickly on the building carbon reduction programme, because this is our big investment piece. And I won't do a quiz because I can't see you, but these are our top 10 energy users. Not too surprising. There are a couple of maybe slightly more surprising ones on there. You need to Pendennis at the top right. They break down like this, so you can see that the top 3 are the really chunky large users, and then it drops off quite a bit. And what we're doing here is I mentioned about the energy programme before. We took that data and we've transferred it into looking at carbon rather than energy, because many of these sites are subject to large master planning work, and we do want to allow growth within the organisation, but we'd want to do that in a low carbon way. So it's not necessarily about just reducing the energy, it's about making it greener, as you know. So you can see that's the percentage there. Unfortunately, we don't have enough money immediately available to make that 20% reduction within just those top 10. So we're actually extending that into the top 21. You can see it's much smaller percentages, but by picking up some of those smaller measures around energy efficiency and reducing energy, we can pick up our target across those at a relatively lower cost. So we have quite a elaborate programme that's developed across those 21 sites. So the top 10 in particular at the moment each have a project team at site with a project client, who's usually the site manager, who report into a programme board, which I run and then reports to our investment programme. But underneath that we have the programme delivery team, which is a 4-consultant team where we have Ingleton Wood on our M&E, we have Huntley Cartwright for QS, WSP is our project managers, and Acanthus Clues as our conservation architect. And that sort of is fed into by the special advice team, which are all our sort of building services managers, curator team, collection team, and so on. And we have across all of those sites, we have lots of pockets of work happening. We have a big group of electrical projects coming through. We're looking at be mean, be lean, be seen and be green. So metering and monitoring, things like just a wholesale replacement with LED bulbs, voltage optimization, pipe lagging, you know, all those sort of unglamorous measures. Then next year we're moving on to things that are slightly more difficult and take slightly longer, around sort of window and door replacement and repair, bits of draft proofing, occasional bits of double glaze, secondary glazing, and then on the last year into the large scale renewables. So things like solar panels on the roof of Osborne House, water source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, and a few air source heat pumps, which will come through next year. So that's a large programme of investment for us, around £3 million secured at the moment, and we're looking at potential for external loans even for the larger scale renewables. So that's exciting to get that going and to start to see that delivering the results in terms of savings. As I mentioned, our procurement team, so that interaction I found really positive and helpful. So working with them, we've now developed responsible procurement training, where, you know, awful sort of talking head thing I do, but also just giving people an idea of what to look for when they are getting a contract. There's a sort of vendor management, that ongoing relationship to make sure that our vendors are actually delivering in the way that they said they would, and a balanced scorecard to allow people to identify this percentage around sustainability in the evaluation. And that has been really successful, most recently with our large waste contractor contract, where the balanced scorecard had sustainability set at about 40%, which completely changed, as you can imagine, the sort of responses we were getting in, and was fantastic for driving that sort of extra innovation around sustainability. We also have our supplier charter, which you probably can't read in great detail on the left here, but it sets out what we will do, what we say we're going to do, what our suppliers should do, and what we'll do together. So it's this kind of working with our suppliers, setting out very clearly our parameters up front. And that's been a really fantastic tool. Moving on to our third pillar, operations. So as I mentioned, this is the sort of area that's beyond the immediate net zero conversation. So we are developing an environmental management system It's a big piece of work, as you know, but it is a hugely helpful tool, and it's allowing us to talk about compliance and legislation, make sure we're ahead of that, but also start to integrate environmental work across a whole series of areas that are not necessarily seen as to do with sustainability up front. So I should show you the picture for that in a moment, but touching on some of the others here, the retail packaging and the recycling side of things, we haven't got anything in against that at the moment, and you can see we've got a 2022-23 baseline, which has had some kickback externally. That's not to say at the moment we're chucking everything in landfill. It's simply that we don't have a solid baseline at the moment. With recycling, that's because we had all of our sites on different contracts. They've all been brought into a single contract, which is just an enormous step forward, because it means we actually can start to measure and drive forward the recycling, the amount recycled from our sites. It also means we can obviously focus on sort of reuse and what's being left behind and all the behavioural change work that goes with that. So that's hugely exciting for us in a slightly nerdy way. I hope you'll appreciate it. Similarly with retail packaging, you know, we have been doing things to reduce the packaging, but we haven't been quantifying that because we haven't got a baseline. So that again is something the retail team are doing at the moment. And part of that is understanding, you know, what's coming into our warehouse in terms of external packaging, which is quite extensive, and sort of identifying the worst offenders. You know, you see here there's quite a lot of wooden swords wrapped in individual plastic. Then looking at our own products, and the retail team have been great at reducing down things like, you know, little how things are tied up and hung up. Little tiny, I learned a new word, gimbal. I think it is a little plastic hook that things hang on in shops. So the gimbal is being replaced. The plastic gimbal is being replaced with one that's cardboard, and so on. So there's also, as you can see here, there's some work on our pension provider, our investment, which is relatively small, very small investment, but you know, we need to set the parameters now to make sure that's doing good. And sustainability sourcing standards is something we're going to be focusing on much more detail next year. Just to give you an overview of what the environmental management system's covering at the moment, these are sort of the headlines and how it's structured. As I mentioned, this is a really great tool for us in terms of getting ahead of some of those big legislative changes, but also working our way through some of these main aspects. And there are a lot of standards to be created here. The standards are not replicating what's there, so they're really much more signposting tools. Whether we actually go for the final ISO accreditation and pay for that at the end is a question we haven't committed necessarily to completely do that, but we're definitely working towards it, and we're using the structure of working towards it to help us tie all these environmental elements together. And this means sort of working across clearly our sort of contractors and our wider stakeholders as well. So lastly, just finishing off with resilience, about looking to the future, you can see that at the moment there's not a huge amount in this area. We have done quite a lot of work on partnerships, but we haven't yet started our risk assessments in earnest. This is because this is the final sort of parts of the team coming on board in the new year. The idea here is to look, using the hazard map data, to look across our sites and get an idea of what the hazards are that are most likely to affect our sites. I think we pretty much know that already. To get a better grip on what vulnerability and exposure really means for our sites. So we have some work in our surveying team that exists around vulnerability, but does it truly bring in, some of the interconnected nature of the challenges? So how the sites work with the gardens, the landscape, the collections and the buildings and the people, and actually what that looks like on the ground. And we have an exciting, we've had some funding from Ecclesiastic Insurance, the Benefact Group, to do a 1-year focus on this piece of work, which is that wider scoping, and then drilling down into detail at 5 of our sites. And that's very much about sort of ground truthing that hazard map data on the ground, understanding what it means, and then how that might lead into recommendations for site management and future investment. And this very hot summer has certainly helped accelerate the interest across the organisation and what that looks like, where we're starting to see, you know, disabled handrails too hot to hold, slides too hot for children to slide down, and whole sections of sort of rhododendrons wiped out by the extreme sort of drought there. So yeah, there's much more focus on that at the moment. Two other things just quickly here. Organisational resilience, I think, is a really interesting area that again is going to be a focus next year. How we navigate that path between on the legislation, the technology and the reputation side towards low carbon economy, and that's a conversation we're constantly having around how much we want to talk to our, you know, how much we want to tell our staff and visitors what's the right thing to do and what's not. You know, how do we want to put carbon footprint data on our menus? Is that a step too far in terms of telling people what we should do? How do you keep that interaction so that you're bringing people with you and not sparking a kind of immediate kickback? And how far can you go on that? And I think that's a really interesting area. And also natural capital is something that we are looking at in more detail, and trying again to find natural capital detail that's not just pulling together existing data sets that we know, you know, we don't necessarily want a document that just says, you know, this area floods, this percentage of your land does this is the amount you could sequester carbon. We want something that's much more directly practical. And on the coastal resilience side of things, we also have this partnership with the World Monument Fund, which is a role we're currently recruiting focused on Hurst Castle, which had a major collapse last February. And this is a piece of work around sharing knowledge around the experience at Hurst Castle, but also thinking about how we look after these coastal sites in the future. Again, focusing on that management and interaction, the questions around loss and damage, and very much looking out. That's very exciting. That's being recruited at the moment, that role. So we're excited to see that start off, hopefully in the new year. Yeah, so coming to the end now, just to say, since the Climate Action Plan came out, so it was approved by the trustees in June, and since then I've been building up the team to help me deliver it, which is fantastic and exciting moment. So we've been having, I think, one person coming in every month since then. So you can see they're colour coded by the areas, the 4 pillars. So my idea was always to have one core person sort of leading each of those areas. So Greg Davis joined us first, and he's leading the environmental management system work. That's a huge amount of work, and within that is energy. Energy is vast, as you know, so very excited to have Helen join us, who's doing the work on energy and understanding that. Greg's doing some amazing work on understanding water and our water use across sites, which is fantastic. Katie Wooldridge joined us for the people side, for the learning piece, and she's focused on that internal learning. With the rest of the funding for her post, I've brought in Monique Stone, who's working on sustainable travel and how we encourage car-free visits. So we're working with Good Journey on that, and looking at cycling, commercial partnerships with cycling, around cycling, looking at our own internal support on travel as well, and how we upgrade, how we revise our internal finance manual on travel, so that it's not the thing that you can fly domestically, for example. We have Paul Lancaster, who comes from our conservation science team, who'll be joining us in January, and he comes with a great deal of knowledge of collections and the impact of climate change on collections. So it's fantastic to have him join us in this seconded 1-year post funded by Benefact to look at the climate resilience side. I mentioned Coastal Connections. We also have a link there to the projects team who are running the Building Carbon Reduction programme. So Tom works very closely with me, oversee that programme, and Amy Atkinson, the project coordinator. So it all feels like it's sort of coming together. Clearly, we're not here to deliver the Climate Action Plan, we're here to support that delivery, but it's exciting to have a team in place. And I suppose just at the end, it's always, as I know you'll all be familiar with, that it's about bringing that Climate Action Plan constantly back to why it's important to the organisation and why, as a heritage charity, working on sustainability is so crucial. And I think largely people are very much get it, but it is often helpful in some ways that this appalling collapse at Hearst Castle happened. And clearly this is not just climate change, it's climate change as an accelerator, but it's a very dramatic and visual way of communicating some of these messages. And sometimes it's difficult to bring the message home without a powerful image. So climate change is one of our biggest risks, and you can see the real impact of that at Hearst. So I'll leave just with this one. This is our amazing Beeston Castle, a very, very active site on sustainability. And actually, when I look at it like that, perhaps it looks quite sort of dramatic, doesn't it? Like that will happen to civilization if we don't do something. But anyway, always nice to finish with a David Attenborough quote. And I think I will stop sharing there. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Ruth. Absolutely fascinating, and really great to see the detail behind the breakdown of how the plan you intend to implement it as well. So yeah, lots of work obviously has been underway over the last year or so. Look forward to seeing the results. Any questions from anybody today? Anything? Oh, Crispin, yeah, please feel free to go ahead. I think you might be on mute still.
I am, you're right, thank you. Sorry. Hi, Ruth.
Hi.
That was really great to see, and thank you for that. And I'm sure Historic England is also in the middle of preparing its own climate strategy. I just wondered, in terms of sort of selling it, if you need to sell it to anybody, what sort of proportion of the capacity of the organisation is this taking up? And are you able to outline benefits that are accruing as a result, which kind of offset some of that effort?
Yes, yeah, it's how much is the time of it taking up? It's interesting. So it's taking up small amounts of lots and lots and lots of people's time. And I've intentionally built it up relatively slowly. What's interesting is I'm actually being asked to give them more work. So I've always been concerned, particularly around site managers, that site managers are focused on running the site and they don't have time necessarily to do all these different things. Actually, increasingly they want to have it in, people have asked to have it as a sort of mandatory element in a PDR, for example, which I deliberately didn't do up front. So it is taking up a bit more. I think the main thing is that it's not seen as something separate, that it is integrated and it's therefore not necessarily separated out as a special extra task, but is part of what it is to be a responsible organisation, a responsible charity. It's just what we do. In terms of selling the cost of the climate action plan, that was an interesting discussion at the trustee board. What's it going to cost us? And we had a very honest conversation about the fact that I don't know what the overall cost of the climate action plan will be. I can tell I can tell some bits, and I said, this is clearly with the building carbon reduction programme, I can give you pretty much exact cost of what that bit will cost us for this section, and that's what you're committing to. You're committing to this £3 million, for example, and this will cost and it will deliver this. You're also, these are the roles I think can save money. So that's, for example, the energy manager role is saving us money all over the place, because frankly, there's so much that needs to be done in that field. But at the same time, you're not going to get overall savings from this exercise, because we will be reinvesting that. So we're ring fencing and reinvesting that money. So actually, it was surprisingly little kickback on that. I think there was an understanding that it was the costs of inaction are so much outweigh the cost of action that there was a willingness to allow some quite a lot of extra spend, and it's a team that, I've asked for quite a few members of the team, and that's gone down okay. So I'm not sure that exactly answers it, but it's difficult to say exactly how much time people are spending.
No, okay, no, but that's useful. I think you're right that generally speaking, people are starting to think a bit more long term rather than short term. And yes, understand that it's not going to, we can't justify it necessarily by a cost benefit analysis in the short.
Well, no, exactly. And that return on investment obsession is something that, you know, we're having to wean ourselves off as well. You know, there has been that quick turnaround, and this is the, you know, it's a conversation about projects, isn't it? Most obviously, you know, how do you invest for the longer term? And that's something that we are having a lot of discussions around, and a really important area. But yeah, I mean, that feels like a wider conversation as well, doesn't it, about that?
Yeah, but as you say, that photograph of the collapse probably does a lot of the talking for you.
Yeah, it's really helpful, because that, I mean, that's absorbing, Hurstcastle has absorbed a huge chunk of the conservation budget, absolutely enormous. And, you know, if the other side falls, you know, that's a question, isn't it? And it's not been built back deliberately. So the rubble has been cleared away, but it's not been built back. We need to have more of those conversations, and I think there's a lot of groundwork going on at the moment about being brave enough to have those conversations. And I know other organisations have sort of clearly been much more open about that as well. So we're not none of this is acting alone, isn't it? We're all working together.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thanks, Crispin. Catherine.
Thanks so much, Ruth. Really interesting seeing that. I was interested in the metrics as to whether, because clearly they'd be different for every organisation, but in terms of how you develop the metrics, was that kind of you leading that, or teams developing them for themselves, or did you get external support to help you through that process?
Yeah, so there was a bit of external support with 3Adapt. Sort of those decarbonisation scenarios were really helpful. So it was sort of, we went through each of those and we said, you know, what are we talking about in terms of staff travel, for example? You know, what percentage are we looking at in terms of that reduction? And we did have some interesting conversations about, you know, what can we expect from staff in terms of transitioning to electric vehicles, for example, because, you know, as a charity, our salary levels are relatively low. Can we expect people to transition to EVs at the speed that we would want them to? Not necessarily. Perhaps we need to go for a medium scenario there, and we'll go for a higher one somewhere else. So there was a bit of conversation with 3Adapt around that. And then taking that from them, I then had a conversation with the sort of some of the people it was most likely to affect. So when it came to allocating KPIs to different departments, I went to those departments and then had the conversation going, well, I think that we should aim for, so for example, with procurement, I think we should aim for all of our suppliers having net zero targets and action plans. And then we went, and then a few people go, oh, oh, but what about individual craftspeople? So it's like, well, that's fair challenge. Okay, so then are we talking about our larger suppliers? What are our larger suppliers, and so on? So they did evolve in conversation. Clearly there are some, like how many external events could we hold a year, that are pretty much kind of based on what you think is reasonable and came from me. But the ones that are much more involved or owned by other bits of the organisation, that was very much, and they had to commit to those and have their name against them for the trustees. So, you know, that's their ownership. I think they will flex. I think, you know, we've only got a couple of years of that climate action plan left already. So we're already thinking about what they will look like for the next phase. And that's really helpful, because then when I'm getting feedback about, well, this is a bit difficult, it's like, well, we can adjust that. We can think about different ways of measuring it next time. What do you suggest?
Great, thank you. Really useful stuff. Okay, any final questions from anybody? Nope. Okay, thanks, Ruth. Really great session.